related myth on sort of issues around communicating information comes from climate, and that's that climate forecasts are always beneficial, and that the innovations, for example, in climate science, such as improved seasonal forecasts, are always of help in reducing climate risks and uncertainties. And I've heard my colleagues, for example, who are arguing to NOAA in the US for funding for climate science, of the sort of incredible social value of improved seasonal forecasts. They really believe this is the reason they should be funded. Well, a decade of research in social science, which was partly initiated by a report I co-authored called Making Climate Forecast Matter quite a few years ago, a decade of research has shown us that climate forecasts aren't always beneficial, and they're not always useful. The benefits are also often less than anticipated. And to just give a few examples, one is that we found that the value of climate forecasts is very often captured by the commodity speculators, particularly in the US, and actually doesn't get through to farmers or consumers because the commodity companies are actually hiring their own forecasters now, and they're actually hiring people to forecast the forecast that the weather forecaster is going to make from the government. And this means that this information has very unequal benefits, especially when there's unequal access to the information or unequal expertise to use it. The second is examples from work from people like Maria Carmen Lemos that show that seasonal forecasts can actually result in policies that make things worse. So that if people don't understand the scope of the forecast, they found that in northeast Brazil, as a result of a seasonal El Nino forecast, the banks actually decided to cut off credit to all farmers, not just those in the area where a drought was forecast. And food prices increased unnecessarily, and there was actually famine created by the response to the forecast, not by the weather event itself, over a much wider region than it needed to be. And then the third sort of example is that improving forecasts can be incredibly expensive and uncertain. Climate modelling is an uncertain science. And perhaps resources might be better invested in reducing vulnerability rather than trying to get the climate forecast more accurate. All right, moving on to the next issue, which is about blaming the wrong causes. I'll focus on one in particular. And that would be that if I could have 10 euros for every time I hear a scientific colleague place most of the blame for environmental degradation on population growth, especially in the developing world, I would be a very rich woman. There's a very strong Malthusian myth that the real problem for the global environment is that there are just too many babies being born, and that we need to make much greater efforts to control population growth for the sake of water, food, energy and ecosystems. The idea that we just haven't done enough to bring the growth of population down. Now, while population growth certainly plays an important role in causing global and regional changes in greenhouse gas emissions or in land use change, it is often not as great as many people assume. There are excellent social science studies that show that growth in raw population numbers is less important than other factors. For example, a major comparative study of causes of deforestation by your neighbour Eric Lamban found population to be a much less significant driver than economics, technology or political factors such as logging and farming for exports or government policies that encourage land use changes. Other studies show that the main drivers of emissions growth in China and many other countries are per capita consumption and exports. So we know that much of China's emissions are actually what is being exported for high consumption in parts of the world where population growth rates are actually quite low. And of course, population is no longer following the exponential path that was burned into the psyche of many scientists in the 1970s. Some of you may have noticed on Francis' graph that growth in global population is levelling off. Fertility rates have dropped dramatically over the last few decades, and demographers now anticipate that world population will level off mid-century at about 9 billion. Now, while this does, of course, pose a considerable environmental burden, I'm not convinced that we haven't done enough to control population, or prioritising population over the many other factors we need to control is the answer. Social science shows us that the drop in fertility rates around the world is less a result of contraception or coercive policies than it is a result of the improving status of women in terms of literacy, employment, and urbanisation around the world, where educated, employed urban women are choosing to have fewer children. A related myth is that there are too many people using common property resources such as fisheries and grazing lands, and that this is causing a tragedy of the commons, as argued most notably by Garrett Hardin. Although most social scientists do not accept this myth anymore, it continues to circulate in some areas of science and policy, most often as a justification for the privatisation of commonly held water, land, fisheries and forests. Now, many of us in social science were very proud last year when Elinor Ostrom received the Nobel Prize in Economics. Lynn's work helped overturn the idea promoted by Hardin that common property resources cannot be managed sustainably and should therefore be privatised. This idea that privatisation is needed for careful resource management continues to underpin efforts to break down community-owned resource management systems and turn people into private land managers, particularly in parts of Latin America where I work. Lynn and her collaborators analysed hundreds of cases where communities collectively managed water, forests, fish and other resources and showed that community management can be very successful as long as certain rules and strategies are in place to robustly govern resources. I think that dispelling myths about the commons and the continuing sort of arguments about the policies to deal with it is very important as we think about how to govern climate through forest protection and through fostering adaptation. How can common property resource managers be rewarded for protecting forests so that financing doesn't just go to privatised systems? How can climate aid foster community adaptation and the sustainable management of the Earth's systems? The privatisation of the commons is just one example of my fourth and penultimate set of myths that I want to look at. The privatisation of the commons is just one example of what has become a dominant assumption, that the best way to manage the environment is through market environmentalism, including payments for environmental services and carbon markets. And I know many of my friends in ecology have been very excited about the move towards payments for ecosystem services, perhaps because they've given up on any other way of protecting ecosystems. But in social science, I would say that there isn't a consensus that putting a price on nature or on carbon is the solution to global environmental change. We already had a bunch of mechanisms, traditional regulations, laws, taxes, and should we really be substituting trading schemes such as carbon markets for those other ways of governing global environmental change? Should we be seeking to protect forests and other natural services by a common currency that can be traded or purchased to meet emission reduction commitments or environmental targets? Now, this isn't just a theoretical debate. Enthusiasm for market environmentalism is widespread. But I believe the social science evidence that it works in practice is very mixed and shows serious problems with the economics, monitoring, ethics and equity of payments for ecosystem service and other market solutions. To give one example, a case study of the very early payments for environmental services schemes in Costa Rica revealed a lot of problems that included difficulties in measuring the ecosystem services people were trying to pay for and in actually creating a long-term sustainable demand for those ecosystem services. It was concluded that programs were only successful in pilot stages when subsidized by big external institutions such as the World Bank or international NGOs. In my own work, we've done a number of field studies on carbon offsets and pilot forest payment schemes. And what we find there is that the payments for carbon reduced or sequestered often don't compensate for the income from alternative land uses, and that the monitoring, verification and reporting of the offsets face very serious challenges that often undermine the legitimacy of the market. More generally, of course, we know that there's very vigorous debate about how to value the non-market benefits and losses, how to price life, loss of ecosystems as we look at the environmental economics of global environmental change. So here I'm just trying to sort of raise some questions about whether market environmentalism is the sole solution, because that's starting to feel like that's the main approach that's being promoted. Okay, the next comment I want to make is about one of the greatest obstacles to collaboration between the natural and social sciences. And that's the expectation or hope from many colleagues in the natural science that social scientists can provide explanations of human behaviour that can be included in predictive models. It's the hope that human behaviour can be understood rationally, quantitatively, and is predictable. Of course, even within climate science or environmental science, there are lots of limits to predictability and phenomena that are very difficult to model. But the problems are vastly magnified in social science, where many aspects of human decision-making and economic development are unpredictable. Now, certainly some social scientists are willing to engage in attempts to quantitatively model and project human behaviour, but others completely reject these attempts. Agent-based and integrated assessment models are making valiant attempts to represent human decision-making and economic relationships. And economists and political scientists and sociologists do provide rational models for human behaviour, such as cost-benefit analysis or game theory. But many social scientists argue strongly against the modelling of human systems and assumptions of rational choice. They note, for example, and these are sort of slightly cheap shots, but they note that socioeconomic models failed to predict the recession, they failed to predict the fall of the Berlin Wall, and they failed to predict the recent rise in food prices. All of these had an environmental footprint that was globally significant.